this beautiful weekend. Thank you for this faith that sustains us and guides us throughout our lives. And a faith that is sometimes strong, sometimes weak, sometimes chock full of doubt and uncertainty. But we give you thanks that this is part of the life experience, and help us to draw a stronger faith today as we think about some of these great people who have thought about faith in the past. Okay, so is anyone here for the first time of the three groups? Here for the first time? Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap of what we've done in the last couple weeks. First week we talked about classical apologetics and why do the question of why do you have faith, and people give the reasons they have faith, and then looked historically to Sigmund Freud and others who took a much more rather than an explanatory, rather than asking a question about faith, actually explained why people have faith. And that is, for Freud, people have faith because they're afraid of death, they're afraid of meaningless whole thing. And so how how that can be deflationary for people of faith, because how can you respond when when someone says, well, you have faith, and the reason you have it is because all of these unconscious fears, and it comes from a place you're not even aware of inside of you. There's no way you can properly respond. So anyway, that was Freud. And then last week we looked at how people like Ernest Becker in the 1970s said, well, everyone is religious, not only people who have faith, but people who even don't have faith, or maybe atheists, because we are all immersed in a meaning system, and that is our culture. And so Becker said that all of culture is an attempt to buffer human beings, buffer ourselves against anxiety, death anxiety, the anxiety of meaninglessness, and these sorts of things. And so that's all of culture. Then we talked about these experimental psychologists who thought Becker had a good theory about why we have culture and why we have all that culture means, but decided that they would test it. And so out of that came this branch of existential psychology called terror management theory, in which people, and Sheldon Solomon, we saw a little video of how when people were reminded of their death, they tended to be more hostile to out-groups, people unlike themselves. They tend to like authoritarian leadership more, and all these, all these ways that that when we're reminded of death, we cling more ferociously to kind of these cultural meaning systems. So anyway, that's kind of where we're at, and today we take a little bit of a different turn, and that is we leave kind of Freud and Becker behind, and we move to William James. And so today we're all about trying to find a different way to think about faith than these other thinkers thought about faith, and we're going to look to William James for that, and then by the end talk about authentic faith. And so William James, about 100 years ago, wrote Varieties of Religious Experience, and it was very descriptive rather than explanatory. There was William James thought that what is the point of speculating of why people have faith? Who can understand human beings and where this stuff comes from? We're very complicated people, right? And so William James didn't want to explain and speculate about why people have faith. He was more of a phenomenologist. Help me out, somebody. He was one of those. He was interested in phenomenology. phenomenologist. There we go.
Yeah, phenomenal.
So the mind is too complex and mysterious to be captured by scientific theory. James ignores religious doctrine. He wants to know, what is faith, what does a religious experience look like? And he wants to describe it. And so he interviewed many, many people, and what he found was that, this is what he said: the happiness which a religious belief affords is a proof of its truth. The happiness that a religious belief affords is proof of its truth. And so he took a very utilitarian sort of perspective on faith. Does it work or does it not, right? And with that, I want to read just a little bit of a portion of a book called From Infinite Jest. It was a novel written in the mid-90s by David Foster Wallace, considered by many, one of the greatest novels of the last 100 years. And it's kind of a satire of American life, American addictions. And, I read this, it took me about a year to get through this book, and it was a great book. There's a part in the book where it's supposed to be set in the future, right? And where humans are addicted to all kinds of things, including entertainment. And the new president, the president who's just elected, is actually a celebrity rather than a politician. And when Trump got elected in 2016, I thought, wow, David Foster Wallace, 20 years before that, he had it down. And so there's a lot of wonderful things in this book, and I'm going to read just this one section, and it has to do with this fellow named Gately, who is, in this novel, is trying to recover from a multi-substance addiction. And so he goes into a halfway house and enters into AA, which is, when he uses the term coming in or hanging in, it means hanging in with the 12-step program. And I think it's just this beautiful scene or reflection on what it means to engage spiritual practices even when you're unsure of the belief that's behind those passages. So for those of you who listen to novels in the car while you're traveling, just imagining you're traveling. This is from David Foster Wallace about this, and it's Gately who's speaking. The process is the neat reverse of what brought you down and in here. Substances start out being so magically great, so much the interior jigsaw's missing piece, that at the start you just know deep in your gut that they'll never let you down. You just know it, but they do. And then this goofy slapdash anarchic system of low-rent gatherings and corny slogans and saccharine grins and hideous coffee, it's so lame, you just know there's no way it could ever possibly work except for the utterest morons. And then Gately seems to find out AA turns out to be the very loyal friend that he thought he had and lost. And so you hang in and you stay sober and straight, and out of sheer hand burned on hot stove terror, you heed the improbable sounding warnings not to stop pounding out the nightly meetings. Even after the substance cravings have left and you feel like you've got a grip on the thing at last and can now go it alone, you still don't try to go it alone. You heed the improbable warnings because by now you have no faith in your own sense of what's really improbable and what isn't. Since AA seems improbably enough to be working, and with no faith in your own senses, you're confused, flummoxed, and when people with AA time strongly advise you to keep coming, you nod robotically and keep coming. And you sweep floors and scrub out ashtrays and fill stained steel urns with hideous coffee. And you keep getting ritually down on your big knees every morning and night, asking for help from a sky that still seems a burnished shield against all who would ask aid of it. How can you pray to a God you believe only morons believe in still? But the old guys say, it doesn't yet matter what you believe or don't believe. Just do it, they say. And like a shock-trained organism without any kind of independent human will, you do exactly what you're told. You keep coming and coming nightly, and now you take pains not to get booted out of the squalid halfway house you'd at first tried so hard to get discharged from. You hang in and hang in, meeting after meeting, warm day after cold day. Not only does the urge to get high stay more or less away, but more general life quality type things, just as improbably promised at first when you came in, things seemed to get progressively somehow better. Inside for a while, then worse, then even better. Then for a while worse in a way that's still somehow better, realer. You feel weirdly unblinded, which is good, even though a lot of the things you now see about yourself and how you've lived are horrible to have to see. And by this time, the whole thing is so improbable and unparsable that you're so flummoxed and you're convinced you're maybe brain damaged, still at this point from all the years of substances. And you figure you'd better hang in this Boston AA where older guys who seem to be less damaged, or at least less flummoxed by their damage, will tell you in terse, simple, imperative clauses exactly what to do, and where, and when to do it, though never how and why. And at this point, you've started to have an almost classic sort of blind faith in these older guys, a blind faith in them born not of zealotry or even belief, but just of a chilled conviction that you have no faith whatsoever in yourself. And now if the older guys say jump, you ask them to hold their hand at the desired height. And now they've got you. And you're free. Now they've got you and you're free. Yep. So this speaks a little bit to this, the way William James wanted to think about faith. People immersed in 12-step programs, they're asked to believe in God, a higher power, even when maybe they don't believe it, but they're just figure it out. And, for millions of people, this sense of this higher power and God works, right? And so this was important for William James, that it works. Freud was a positivist, you wanted to empirically prove things. For William James, he was a pragmatist. Truthfulness of a belief was a matter of practical consequences. So, when I ask you, does religion work, how would you respond? Does faith work?
It works for those who work it.
What are some of the positive aspects of religion and religious belief?
You have a smug appreciation of the universe, and that you kind of figured it out, and you're very lucky. And a lot of people will never figure it out.
That's a result of having faith?
Yes.
And you mentioned community?
I think that's an important aspect of it.
Okay.
I think it brings a desire to bring people to the light with you to experience the joy that you found.
Mm-hmm. So there's a joy that comes from faith, from the spiritual practice?
From the revelation that brings the faith, that the faith comes from, doesn't just come of its own. I think it comes, I guess people have different experiences, but an understanding that things were changing, things were going a new direction that was better for me, and that I hadn't created a sense of faith. But anyway, one of the things it did, it was like I had to lose everything in order for things to start getting, I didn't lose everything. I still had my family around me, and some good things were happening. Obviously good things happened, and then that created a sense that something was looking out for me. And then after that, you want to give and love and help other people to find it. That was the experience of it.
Good. Anyone else?
Hi. It's very comforting especially if you're alone. Well, anybody. If you're alone, you're never alone. You know, there's always someone that is there that you can come on.
Okay.
That speaks very much to something I said when you asked why I believe in God or something like that. And I tried to express that my faith gave me a kind of a respite or a joy or relief in knowing that I was not my own last offense. But I think you said it a little bit closer to why my faith is strong. I can plan because I don't have to worry, and I see results. So no one can uh, no one can tell me that faith doesn't work. I have seen it, and very much. I was very much been very much impressed by your discussion of British empirical philosophers. I too have read Hume and Berkeley before him and Locke before him, and even William James. And I like these guys because, well, I like them because they seem to not bother with philosophies that can't be measured, that they couldn't. And that's why they call them empirical philosophers, actually. So I kind of like those guys, and yeah, faith works because it works, and it doesn't work if you don't believe it works, because you can't see it working because you don't know what to look for.
Yeah. So William James would say, "It is by the root, by the fruits you shall know them, not by its roots." So it's not where does it come from, but rather what fruit does it produce in people's life? What effect does it have? But I mean, if we were to think about it, though, we could recount. I mean, we're all kind of connected to a church, so it must work for us somehow, faith, right? But I think we can all think of sort of the negative fruits of faith, of religion, right? Aren't there some negative aspects of religion?
Well, I was thinking to your earlier question, um, faith is a framework of principles which give us guidance, and that can be all kinds of principles, it can be all kinds of guidance, and community holds it together. Community of faith holds it together. So it could be, an eye for an eye, or it could be, turn the other cheek. I mean, it could go whichever way your community supports it. Community of faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's these principles, and so when we look at the scriptures, for instance, we see in the Old Testament eye for eye, and then Jesus turns around and says, "Well, you've read that, but here, think about this. This is what I offer you. If someone hits you on your cheek, turn to them the other." So that's a very different way of thinking about it, right? So I mean, Emily, do you have something?
Well, you asked what are negative things of religion, and I actually could come up with a litany of them, but the first one that popped into my mind was the religions, and to me, religion and faith are two different things. The religions that blame something because you didn't have enough faith. To me, that's a negative of a religion, not doesn't have anything to do with your faith.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we can all see some of the negative aspects of ways of thinking. Leads to pathology or fundamentalists, terrorism, othering people. These are kind of the negative aspects of religion. I think Al, for somebody who was here a few weeks ago, said that people in their families, they've given up on religion because religion is the reason human beings fight each other. They fight wars over religion, and there's probably some truth to that. But if there was no religion in the world, I'm sure human beings would still find something to fight over. So it's just kind of the human experience. So the question for William James and for the writer of this book that we're reading is, does faith only emerge from the repression of, or does it only emerge as a consolation, as a function? Let's see. The question for us today is existential consolation the sole function of belief? Does belief necessarily imply existential repression? In other words, does it, just because you have faith, does it mean that you're buffering yourself against um, your fear of death? And in other words, can belief refuse to play the part of an existential narcotic? And if it did, what would it look like? What would it look like if a faith was unrepressed? And so William James submitted for two different kinds of spirituality. One he called healthy-minded spirituality, which is kind of a weird designation, but it represses disturbing stuff and it buffers us against death. And so you hear people who are fundamentalists, they have this way of looking at the world and thinking about God, and they cannot allow for any other way, because if any other way of thinking about God or the world is true, then it erodes their sense of certainty, and that brings forth a lot of anxiety. And so that's really tough for people. Um, so there's this healthy-minded, but the second way that William James thought about faith was he described as there are these sick souls. These are not driven by the need for consolation, but driven by an understanding that the evil aspects of our lives are of its essence, and the world's meaning most comes home to us when we lay them to heart. So this is a faith that does not does not repress darkness or death, meaninglessness, but gathers them together and thinks about them and incorporates them. And so, if any of you have read Richard Rohr, you know these contemplative thinkers. They're these sick souls, aren't they? Because Richard Rohr wrote a book called "Everything Belongs: The Good, the Bad, Everything." It's all to be part of the human and spiritual experience. There is no sectioning off these things and disregarding them as evil. Jung talked about incorporating your shadow, right? And there's this great quote from Jung that goes, it helps in dealing with the darkness in others if you've dealt with the darkness in yourself first. And so here's this thing that it all belongs in human consciousness, and it's not to be buffered against by our religious faith. But that's a tough road, isn't it? Existential awareness is a tough road. The preoccupation of the sick soul is the existential predicament posed by our infinite vulnerability in the face of death, where evil and death are unrepressed. There is an emotional cost, but James suggests that this existential honesty makes the sick soul resilient in the face of difficult life experiences. Death and suffering can puncture the healthy-minded person's religious worldview. I had a parishioner once, my very first church I was in, and, well, a couple that came to the church, and the woman was very involved in the church, and her husband would come with her on Sundays but wasn't involved in the church otherwise. And so during some function, I got with him and I started talking to him, about life, about spirituality, faith, and these things. And he said, well, I really don't believe. I just come to support my wife. He said, I used to believe in God, but I had an adult child, and he died in a tragic accident. And he said, before that happened, I used to get down on my knees every night and pray to God to protect my family. And when that happened, I realized my prayers weren't answered. I was done. And you know, that's a really hard thing, but that can happen, right? I mean, if we have this really strong faith in God and that our prayers will be answered if we pray, and then they aren't, it can be very debilitating to faith, right? And so James suggests that all of this comes together and that our faith, rather than buffer ourselves against death and evil, offers us a vehicle for exploring these things. Now, can you think of scriptures that are consonant with this idea of the sick soul or the exploration of all the existential themes? Are there any kind of scriptures that say, that don't offer really kind of these beautiful promises, but rather emerge from a real um, difficult place? Any scriptures come to mind?
Prodigal son.
What?
The prodigal son.
Prodigal son? Okay.
Just thinking of the younger, the son that stayed faithful, the father's position in the story, the son that comes home. I mean, there's just so many
Layers.
layers.
A lot of layers to that, of grace and forgiveness, of abuse. Yeah, yeah. You mentioned Job. Job is huge, of course, where Job is. I mean, you have the Psalms and you have Job right next to each other, right? In the Psalms, there's this worldview that if you're a good person, you will be rewarded in this life. If you're a bad person, you will be punished in this life, right? That's kind of the worldview presented there. In Job, it's like this good person gets all this evil heaped upon them. And it's kind of like a challenge to this way of thinking, this simplistic way of thinking about faith. And it would be nice if at the end of Job, God explains to him everything, but God doesn't explain anything. He just says, "You're never going to understand it, right? You're never going to get it." And so that's definitely part of this idea of existential awareness. No easy answers. Any other parts of Scripture?
Value questioning wisdom literature.
Wisdom literature.
Value questioning wisdom literature as opposed to value proving.
Okay, value questioning, value rather than value proving literature.
Wisdom literature from the Bible.
Yeah. So you have Lamentations, for instance.
Or Ecclesiastes.
Well, so you're right. If Ecclesiastes is probably the epitome of this sort of faith journey where everything's meaningless and you just try to find your way through life and enjoy it the best you can. So that's definitely one of these places. Lamentations, where all these prayers of lament, prayers of complaint. What were you going to say, Marianne?
Parable of a sower.
Say more about that.
It's the one where grain is cast on different types of ground and yields or doesn't, or thrives or doesn't.
Yeah.
And some interpretations are that we're all of the patches of ground, all the different types.
Yeah. And some just aren't going to respond.
You know, we read the Psalms of praise and thankfulness and all of that, but we never read those Psalms where the psalmist is asking God to reach out and crush their enemies. And there are a number of those that are
Very good one.
kind
That's
of
my favorite.
a little troublesome.
Haven't played that
But
one.
I think what I take away from that is that God is not what I create God to be, but God is.
God is not what I create God to be. Meister Eckhart, the great mystic in the 13th century, said, "The greatest leave-taking is leaving God for God." So there's all these scriptures that you've mentioned. There's also Psalm 22, that Jesus quotes on the cross, right? Starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Not a lot of blue sky promises there, right? This is a psalm of abandonment, and that this is part of the human experience. And then, of course, Christian literature, St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul, The Cloud of Unknowing, and these are, and Meister Eckhart, of course. This sort of spirituality is called apophatic spirituality, where God is not found. God is found by naming everything that isn't God. And so, all your thoughts about God, all, so there was this medieval sort of mysticism that said God cannot be known through human experience, was only known apophatically, in other words, in the darkness. And so every time you have God is this, or God is doing this, or I have this wonderful sense of God's presence, that all of that was not God, but rather that the absence of God, in the void, is where God was experienced. And it seems kind of paradoxical, but this is kind of a classical way of thinking about faith. So, what kind of Christian do you think you are? What kind of faith do you have? Is it more of a healthy soul, or more of a sick soul sort of faith?
Yes.
Well then, let's discover what kind of faith we have.
I was gonna say selfish.
If you would, let's pass it.
Quick definition, review, sick versus healthy soul, please.
So just take one of these. Okay, I will in just a second. Take one of these and pass them down. This is a defensive theology scale. So for William James, the healthy-minded were those people who used faith as a defense against all that is difficult in life. Remember last week I talked about the woman who came up to another grieving woman and said, God must have needed another angel. This way of quickly explaining away in theological terms difficult experiences, whether they be death or whatever is involved in human experience. So this is considered for James to be healthy-minded Christianity, or a healthy-minded faith. The sick soul is one, as we've been talking about, who incorporates, doesn't repress, but rather incorporates all of life into their experience of faith, and doesn't have any easy answers. Maybe doing this scale will help us. I have some pens here.
So a healthy, I see the paradox in the meaning here. So you're saying that a healthy faith, the kind I have, is a shield against the bad.
A shield.
And you're saying that the sick ones are saying, hey, it's all good.
Even the bad is good.
Even the bad is
well,
good.
maybe not good, but necessary. So,
Wes, is there any way to show that to the Zoom folks?
oh, you got a pen.
I could go and scan it right now and email it to her.
That'd be great.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. I appreciate it, Marion.
Sorry about that, Zoom folks.
Yep, I'll scan it and
People have writing
email
interest.
it to you right now. Sue Bennett too. Oh, okay, Sue,
Thank you, Deborah.
to both of you.
Yeah, there's a few of them. Yeah, I should explain that. So this is Richard Beck's defensive theology scale. Give each statement a numerical value between 1, you strongly disagree with the statement, and 7, you strongly agree, with 4 being neutral. And so just put that number next to the statement on the left-hand side. Now, there are a couple of these, like 2 of these, that are reverse scored. So where you see in parentheses it saying reverse scored, if, for instance, you want to put a 1 there, actually put a 7, and vice versa. And so, and if actually you want to put a 2, which is pretty strongly disagree, then put a 6. And I'm sorry I don't have the full scale at the top there, but
We were supposed to do the reverse, not do what we think, do the reverse,
well,
or do it as an alternative on the side.
yeah, well, if you wanted to put, for instance, in the one in divine solicitousness, I don't think God intervenes much in the small details of my life, even if I do care about them. If you,
Oh, I see, if it says reverse scored.
yeah, if you strongly agree, I don't think God intervenes, rather than put 7, put 1. If you strongly disagree, rather than put 1, put 7, and then, of course, it's a scale. Put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
I'm wondering why he scores this disagree 1 and strongly 7.
Well, or
I didn't
anywhere
get
in
that.
between. So if you,
I understand it, I just don't understand why he chose 7 for agree instead of disagree, but maybe that's just the way I think.
okay.
That's fine. I'll manage. I'll manage. Strongly disagree. Strongly agree. All right.
So does
Maybe
that
he can-
actually have a definition of God? Because that
Yeah, that,
A definition of God. Well, I think probably he has a Christian notion of God, but regardless of, you know, what your religion is, whether it be any Islam or whatever, this notion of a higher power or a God who rules the universe.
the influence to me has
It may-
that definition.
Good question. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
When Deborah comes back in, tell her it worked. Thank you.
I need a different pen. This isn't her pen. That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, whichever one's there. I think this one is one.
I'm just going to actually pulls you into a positive way of thinking when you start looking at it and thinking, you know, I do think about it. Even if I don't feel that great today or feel like he's listening, I actually, yeah.
Right.
Pastor Wes,
Yes.
are we allowed to say, talk about the problems we have with this scale?
Yeah, well, this scale I got from this website, which I've never sat with people before and actually done it, so I'm seeing some problems too. Sorry about that. Maybe we can discuss that.
There is no room for God giving us intelligence to answer, to deal with some of life's events. But anyway, we can talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. How's everyone doing with this thing?
We need an I don't know alternative.
Okay, well, I think that's 4. That's supposed to be right in the
Yeah.
middle.
I can't even trust my answers now.
So I think as you're reading this, you can see what they're trying to get to here.
What's that? I did each one.
Yeah, I sure.
So before you add these up, there are a couple that are indicated they need to be reverse scored, and there's a couple more that actually there is no indication. So for instance, under special protection, the second one, whatever you put there, then put the opposite score there. So if you strongly agree with that, or if you agree to somewhat, then put the corresponding opposite score. So if you want to put a 7 there, actually change it to a 1. And then denial of randomness is the 2 middle ones also need to be reverse score.
Denial of randomness, you gotta,
I'm losing points like crazy here.
So if you, for instance, want a 6 there, you know, make it a 2.
so the 2 in the middle of denial are supposed to be reversed. The bottom, the last
Yeah.
one.
The first and the second are straightforward. The middle 2 are reverse scored. And then add up your score.
Did he say these 2 are supposed to, so this one and that one are supposed to be switched?
So this is Richard Beck's defensive theology scale to measure existential consolation versus existential awareness. So How's everyone doing? Have they added up their scores yet, or are they still in the middle of thinking? Okay. What are some of your scores when you get to the end?
114.
114?
Yeah.
46.
46.
23.
66.
23. 70.
78.
78.
68.
I had to reverse score.
68. Anyone else?
66.
Dare to say what it is?
And even 70.
And even 70. Okay, there's some like middle scores in there. And I think some of you have raised some good points. You know, how do we define God? And there's a lot of questions about free will and other things you could kind of grapple with in here. But this is supposed to give you a sense of what kind of faith you have. Do you have the healthy-minded or the sick-soul faith? There's nothing wrong with one or another or the other, but they're just different. You know, when I served a church in Seattle, it was a church, Presbyterian church, very progressive, kind of like this one. And, if you would ask at a meeting, you'd ask people to pray. Nobody wanted to pray. Nobody wanted to pray out loud, And, everyone was just kind of, had faith, but it was a real questioning faith, and questions were always invited. And regardless of where you were in your faith journey, whatever your perspective was great. But the church was very close to another Presbyterian church, and it was called University Presbyterian Church. And whereas the church I served, have maybe 150 people there on a Sunday, University Presbyterian Church had like 3,000 people there on a Sunday. It was a very evangelical church, and they had a staff of many pastors. And so I was doing some work with the presbytery at a committee level, and they were looking for a new pastor, so I went to help them find a new pastor, and so I worked with this small group. And my experience of them was just so different than the experience of the church I was serving, because the church I was serving kind of had this sick soul sort of understanding of Christianity, but this evangelical Presbyterian church had a very sort of a much more, I guess you would call, for this class it would be called existential consolation, but they were much more sure of themselves and of God. And when you ask somebody to pray, or when you said, would someone like to pray to close the meeting, 4 or 5 hands went up. And they were all very comfortable with praying in public because they were very comfortable in their understanding of who God was. And so that's kind of a simplistic way of thinking about these two sorts of faith, these two sorts of Christianity. So some of you had very high numbers, some of you had very low numbers. The high numbers would be associated with what would be called a healthy-minded faith. Lower numbers would be more of that existential awareness sort of, God is much more mysterious and less connected to me personally and less available to me and my needs personally. So what are your thoughts on that?
What was your score?
I didn't get to the place of adding them up.
We'll take a minute.
Okay, I'll add them up in due time. Somebody else talk. What are your thoughts?
Maybe it's free will, but to me the whole thing on this scale is choice. I mean, do we choose how we're going to react to a situation, or is we just going to wait for God to intervene? I mean, I am totally on the side of choice personally. That believing in God gives me guidance of what's good in life or what's purposeful in life, but I can choose either side of the path or either path. And to me, every single question do I choose the thing, if I'm ill, blame God. or if I wanna be healed, ask God and it will happen. I think it's my choice on what avenues I take to get well, you know? I don't wait for God to do it. I think it's on me.
I think he'll show you the way. I mean, it's like if you want to get well, I mean, if you're really at that point of willingness, the people will start coming right with the students. But I also think that sometimes it just gives you the inspiration to act at a time, or I mean, I hadn't really thought it was somebody else, but when I reacted in a way that did something positive that helped somebody or whatever, and I knew within that I needed to do something. I mean, I could say that was God reacting, but it was interesting how people don't always respond well to it. And I start taking it, well, then I must have done the right thing, because people sometimes even when you do the right thing, they think it's wrong, you know, and it's so obvious. I just had that happen in a job I was at where I had to do something. It was kind of basically protecting somebody, and they totally misinterpreted what was going on, and I was so confused by their reaction to it. I mean, I was like, I got an old fender bender on the way home. I mean, I was really out of it, and I just anyway. But so it's just funny how people can choose to see things their own way, and all I could kind of do was finally hope that eventually they'd come to the conclusion that that I hadn't actually done anything bad, but that I did the right thing, and I don't know, that was weird. That was just strange. But yeah, I guess I'm just talking about when you're close, he shows you the right way when you stay close to him, right? And you just kind of know how to react. But not everybody's that way, because they're studying books and techniques and maybe books on racism or whatever, and they've got a preconceived notion about what you do and what it means, you know. And because I'm, you know, white and that person's black or whatever, that means that what I'm doing is wrong. And they just are sort of living. That's it. I think the media during that time kind of inspired a lot of people to be confused about what people's behavior meant, and that it meant racism. People that started taking that sort of blanket mentality, and I found that was coming out in people that were younger, that were more easily influenced by things like that. I was the same way, so I know.
By the way, my score was 62. So maybe I'm in the middle somewhere.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The highest score you can get is 7, and there's 5 questions, so it seems to me the highest score would be 35. How do you get?
Wrong.
I was a math major, so maybe
20 questions. There's 20 questions.
Oh!
Sorry.
You got 1 times 20 to
That's
7
why
times.
it's confusing. Oh.
Yeah.
I can see
I think I had the hardest time with the special insight section in that God gives me clear answers. Well, good for you, but that's
right.
I mean, I think it's a matter of discernment and not really being sure that what I'm doing is the best, but I think with some guidance from, you know,
I would have given that one a 0 if 0 was a possibility.
clear. I mean, I have many traumatic things happening. Okay. Oh wait, I'm in the wrong set. God clearly guides me along the path. Well, that's a warning sign right there. Okay.
I didn't clean that
God
up
wants
before
me
I
to
copied this.
Yeah. So yeah, this whole idea of certainty and clarity is not my experience. I sort of like go forth in faith and hope for the best. You know? I just
Right.
more of a, you know, okay, choose hope over, you know, optimism over pessimism, choose abundance over, and you know, I love to wallow with the people that like to talk about hope and peace and grace and justice, and I feel like that makes it better in the long run.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, depending on where we're at in our lives, and you ask me, depending on the day it is, I would change my scores probably, you know, because many days I feel, and you probably experience the same thing, I feel a deep spirituality and you know, like a presence maybe. that is undefinable, but a presence that's with me and a presence for good. And then sometimes, you're saying with Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so it can change. One of the things that, of course, Richard Beck wrote this book as an experimental psychologist. And what was important for him is to run some experiments on these two type of Christians, these two type of people who have faith. And the experiment he runs and tells about in his book is that he takes this group of college students who are all purport to be Christians, if I remember the experiment right. And then he has them evaluate a writing by a Buddhist person about, I'm messing this up. Well, I think I have some notes here. Gave tests to Christian students in regard to how they felt about Buddhist students. Is there a difference in feelings toward Buddhist students determined by the type of believer? Across mortality salience conditions, sick souls do not show worldview defense like the healthy-minded do. So, what he did is the people who had this, what we would call sick souls, even when they were reminded of their death, remember terror management theory, when people were reminded of their death, they tended, people who were different than them, they kind of didn't like as much. And so for sick souls, even when they were reminded of their death, they didn't other the Buddhist students like those with the healthy souls did, or the healthy-minded spirituality did. When they were reminded of their death, especially, and regardless, they just tended to think that the Buddhist students think less of the Buddhist students. Did anyone else read the book? Did you get to that place, John?
Yeah, we both read it.
Okay.
I think that I'm having trouble remembering. In some of the treatments, there was a difference between mortality salience and no mortality salience, but I think in the one you're describing, there was no difference in mortality salience. So it was just like the healthy soul people didn't like the Buddhist students, and the sick soul people were more tolerant toward the Buddhist students' essay.
Yeah.
That's my recollection.
And I think we can all see this in our culture, right? When I first came into the Sacramento Presbytery 12 years ago, I was coming to a progressive church, and at the time, the Presbytery was split between evangelicals, healthy-minded Christians, and sort of the sick souls, which were the more progressive churches, right? And the more progressive churches were more open to other faith traditions and other ways of thinking about spirituality, right? And so I come into the Presbytery, and I am questioned. Pastors in those days, when they came into the Presbytery, even though maybe they'd been serving and been ordained for many, many years, they still had to get examined. Right. And usually this was a pretty brief experience. I was examined for an hour. Even though I'd been a pastor for 20 years, examined for an hour, and that's because there was this kind of battle going on in the Presbytery. And a lot of these churches since then, the more evangelical churches, have left. So it's a little different experience now. But there was this battle going on, and so I remember I said something about Scripture, or I don't remember, or I hinted that I was a universalist in regard to salvation, and this person got up and said, well, what do you, for some reason I had maybe brought up Buddhism, but anyway, this person got up and goes, well, what do you tell your Buddhist friend? Don't you tell them that they're not saved and they're going to heaven? So, and I kind of said, well, for one thing, that's well beyond my pay grade of determining the eternal destiny of people. But, for some folks, it's very cut and dried. You either have this born-again experience, and if you don't, then you're out, right? And so I think even without Richard Beck telling us about this scale and these two different kinds of Christians, we experienced that. And I guess this class is just to say that it's okay if you have a lot of questions about faith, and if you find yourself sort of as this sick soul Christian, that you can find in that an authentic faith that may be clouded with doubts and may be clouded with questioning, but it finds there is plenty of nurturing for this kind of faith to be found in Scripture, whether you're looking at Job or parts of some of the wisdom literature of Psalms, of Jesus' life, and also in the classic Christian literature since then of this kind of faith experience.
Can I add just one comment?
Yeah.
I often give my students these kinds of scales. Androgynous scale, for example, where you're looking at whether men and women share similar values and abilities and capacity. I find it very troublesome.
Recording it now? No, I've been recording.
Tolerate
I've been recording the whole time.
6 souls.
There's a branding error, but there.
Yeah, I think William James didn't come up with the best ways of labeling that.
And that suggests an intolerance in some ways of a scale that should be recognizing that both sides, both components of this scale have value in them. I'm troubled by the notion of predestination, so I resonated to the notion of what choices do we have in life, and I recognize that I tell my students, perhaps 80% of your life is shaped. It might be shaped by your religion, it might be shaped by your social class, it might be shaped by your race and your gender. What choices do you have, and what's going to be your legacy with those choices? But that it's not predestined either by faith, class, sex, or race. You have some degree of action and agency in your life, but you may not have all of that agency. It's not you are not destination. You are not the predestined person in your life.
Yeah.
So those are some of the challenges I've had in teaching my students over time.
Just in regard to kind of William James, he was, if you know anything about William James' life, he was a sick soul in many ways, and had that sort of experience of spirituality, and struggled with depression and a lot of things in his life. So I think he would consider him, I don't know why he called them sick souls, but maybe it was kind of a reflection of his own feelings about it. Any other final comment?
Yeah, I just want to say that mine are kind of based on two miracles that happened to me. The first one was I was really ill, and I recovered from that, and then I could tell, and I was really a strong Christian, and I recovered from that, and then I had the symptoms that this illness was going to come back, and I prayed to God that I would be, that He'd take care of me, I wouldn't have this, and I did have it. So I had this illness a second time, and I thought to myself, well, either there is no God or God doesn't care about me. So for about 10 years, I punished God, and I did not go to church, and I didn't really believe in Him. I was really mad, and then I decided, the rain falls on the wicked and the good, and that it was God's choice what happened to you, and the traumatic events. everybody had them, and then it was how you, if you believed in God, or at least it didn't cause you to be a embittered person. And I ended up believing that it was a matter of whether or not you manifested love. I feel like everybody has love in their heart when they're born, and that if you manifest this love, you could be an atheist even, you know. And anyways, all the spiritual paths sort of lead to God. And then I had a final experience recently where I started bleeding from my nose and my mouth, and I thought I was gonna die. And the EMTs came, and immediately I stopped bleeding. And then I didn't realize that, but I was really nervous, and I was really scared. And then I thought, you know, God, I've had a good life, and I've done good things, and I'm ready, God. And that was the end of my fear, and I've never felt afraid about God again. I just...
Thank you. And I think that leads us back into the scripture that we started with, and that is the story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Remember, they don't bow down to worship the God that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and this throws Nebuchadnezzar into a rage because they're challenging his worldview and his understanding of God, and so he's going to, if they don't bow down, he's going to throw them into the furnace. And remember what Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they answer the king and say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter." Mm-hmm. Right? Faith is faith. You know, we don't need to defend our faith to you. But then they say, "If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let God deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." And so, you know, they end by saying, we don't know. You know, we don't know. We have no certainty that God's going to answer our prayers and deliver us from this evil you've set up. And we just have no confidence that that's going to happen. But regardless, either way, this is our faith, and we are not going to bow down to these gods. And so, and you know how the story ends. And so, perhaps that's where we are. Even though, you know, we may not have, maybe we have doubts, it is still this faith that we hold on to. And I'll just quote, it's interesting that you talked about love, because that's where Beck ends up. He says, "Perhaps then in the final analysis, faith, dogmatically understood, must be traded for love, and that doubts are the burden that believers must carry to keep their eyes open to the suffering of others." He quotes 1 Corinthians 13, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love." And that's the end of the book. Thank you all for being a part of this class, and I hope it's been helpful for you in your, I know it's a lot of heady themes that we've been thinking about.
No, it's good.
I hope it's been useful as you've been thinking about your own faith journey. Thank you.